obviously there is always public pressure on government to take a, let's call it a controlling influence, and this is often arises and has often arisen in football and football governance, and obviously that's led us to where we are now. But obviously we are also seeing this extending into other sports. We've obviously had select committee hearings and scrutiny in relation to Premiership rugby following the collapse of 3 Premiership clubs, and of course in cricket, in relation to and arising from the Asim Rafiq allegations. The latter is particularly notable, by the way, because that has now led to a new independent cricket regulator, which actually has a broad remit across anti-corruption, anti-discrimination, general discipline, general misconduct, safeguarding as well. We'll come on to that in a minute. So from your perspective, can you foresee a world in which the statutory regulator or a statutory regulator may extend its role or a role into these other sports and indeed other areas?
So really interestingly, when we were putting together the review, lots of national governing bodies came to me privately and said, is this something, will there be recommendations in here that we can use for our own purposes? To which the answer was absolutely. And some of that is around governance. Some of it was around financial distribution, by the way, so sports where there are pyramids. And whether or not there was a way of sort of kind of almost stealing the IP from the review and using it for their own purposes. And that's what I think the cricket regulator is in part, is sort of built a little bit on, along with its own challenges. And you'll remember that at the select committee, the sports minister of the day did say that if cricket didn't sort itself out, then they would but then government would also think about a cricket regulator. This cricket regulator is different to the football regulator, and I would argue
private regulator for
it's a private regulator, and I would actually argue that the FA does a lot of its own regulation around safeguarding corruption.
Yeah, and it does it well. But that's also because the FA has vast resources to enable it to do so. And I think for me, one of the challenges is the reason why safeguarding, I think, is an area that needs to be looked at on a cross sport basis, is that all sports are under pressure to obviously adopt proper rules, competent and reliable systems for gathering and handling intel, handling investigations, turning intel into evidence, prosecuting cases. And quite simply, many governing bodies, which also double up as regulators, don't have the resources or expertise to deal with those matters. Certainly in the context of safeguarding, that could extend into athlete welfare as well. And to me, that the FA, the RFU, the England and Wales Cricket Board probably aren't good examples because they have the resources to deal with that. But there's
I'm not sure they would argue they have the resources to deal with it.
Well, they probably would argue that. But then if they would argue that, my goodness, what would some of the other 47 governing bodies in England say?
So I think we have to be really careful not to put a template of one sport and overlay it onto another sport, because I don't think it works like that. And I think that there are differences here in the football regulation as there is perhaps in something like safeguarding or corruption or integrity in terms of cricket, for example. And I think one of the challenges, if again, just cast your mind back to Bury, and if you've ever heard anyone at the time that was involved talk about Bury, challenges that they faced are things like concerns were being raised, but they would go to the EFL, and the EFL would say it's not to do with us, go to the FA, and the FA would say it's nothing to do with us, go back to the EFL.
So you're passing between the governing bodies.
Yeah, and I think that there was just no, the EFL and the Premier League are both, at the moment, the competition organiser and the regulator. And that's where then sort of kind of sometimes the challenges arise, because it's not quite clear exactly what the role is. And then you've got the FA, who's supposed to be the regulator, who can't intervene in that particular area. Well, therein lies
the inherent conflict, because...
So you just can't take the template of what we've done on the independent football regulator and put it into rugby or put it into cricket, but you can take some of the principles behind it. And I do think that, certainly when I was still in post, we were looking at potential for not an overall sport regulator, but perhaps an ombudsman.
Yeah.
And that was in part on a couple of cases that had gone through the governing bodies, and the outcomes weren't quite accepted by the people that were taking those cases, and they didn't feel that the process had been particularly independent, and actually you could see their argument on some of that. So it's like, could we have some sort of independent ombudsman in sport? That kind of died actually as I left. It was very early conversations anyway, but but there was definitely an appetite, I think, for perhaps something slightly separate to bring in some of these other issues that sport faces.
Yeah. I mean, we've obviously talked about other sports. It would actually also be interesting just to discuss women's football and women's sport. Obviously, I know that this is an area that you're obviously passionate about. Women's football in particular, but other women's sports as well are continuing to grow at pace. We've seen that certainly with the new WSL broadcasting deal, the influx of new and actually quite different commercial partners, large and also, healthy and diverse crowds, and indeed a healthy percentage of the 100 franchise valuations were attributed to the success of the women's 100. I don't think the media has actually put enough weight on that when they've been talking about the huge success of the ECB's seal. And we certainly see this in our practice at Sheridan's too, which obviously follows market trends as you would expect, and women's sport now makes up a healthy percentage of our work, which is very different to what it was, say, 3 years ago. Now, the fan-led review and the white paper all considered issues in men's football, and you touched upon this a little earlier, but you obviously heard from stakeholders involved in the women's game, and it would seem to me that, and I'd be interested in your views, that there's an unmissable opportunity for the women's game to potentially, for want of a better phrase, to learn from some of the mistakes from within the men's game.
For sure. We had a whole chapter on the women's game in the review, which concluded that there needed to be a separate review.
And that was Karen
Carney's review. Because it's very clear that there were mixed views about the future of women's game, how it should progress from an investment perspective, from a professional perspective, right down to a heritage issue. Whether or not clubs should separate from their men's teams and become independent entities, and so on. And so it just became something that was too big for this review. Yeah. But actually, what was clear is that the door needed to be open for future regulation if it was required. And actually, I think that, again, there's still very different views on it. Critics say that the legislation should have the women's game as part of the independent regulator now. Yeah. But actually, many people in the game, from a day-to-day operational perspective, say we're not ready for it. You know? And I think that's an important thing to remember. And so, I mean, it's wonderful to see the growth of the women's game, but it's still finding its way. Yeah. And I think it has to be allowed to find its way, but with one eye sort of kind of very consciously on some of the mistakes that have been made over decades.
That's vital, isn't it?
Yeah. And there's not this definitive list of things, and some mistakes that some clubs have made are not actually mistakes for the same decisions that have been taken in other clubs. So I think men's clubs I'm talking about. So there has to be sort of this general view of basically allowing it to grow, allowing it to make some of those mistakes, and then learning from itself. So it has to grow organically, albeit with everyone supporting it and wanting it to succeed.
Yes, and it will succeed, but there's going to be a few bumps in the road. I mean, there are already kind of structural issues arising in relation to the gap that it's developing between the top of the game and lower down the pyramid, if we can even call it a pyramid. Success is obviously attached at the minute to being linked to a high profile men's Premier League team, and obviously all of that is the sort of thing that we'll need to change to make it a viable and competitive league, and also a true commercial force in its own right.
But you see that in other parts of the men's game. You know, if you go even further down the pyramid into the grassroots of men's football, you know, you see people who own football clubs, you know, I don't know, Southern League, I don't know, whatever, Eastern League 2 or whatever, and they've got an owner who can afford to put in a 3G pitch and therefore make their club commercially viable 7 days a week, which allows them to invest in their first team, which enables them to go up the pyramid. You know, so actually...
Except Sutton United did that, and then they had to rip up because they got
ludicrous.
promoted to...
Absolutely ludicrous decision. And actually we did put that in the review, because I think the thing about... So I'm, contrary to all the opposition and criticism of the regulator, I'm a massive fan of the Premier League.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I have always said is that the Premier League wealth and its redistribution has to be done within the parameters of good governance. You need those guardrails on, right? So by having better governance lower down the league and the money going from the Premier League, you're going to get more from that.
Yeah.
I've always said it's like, at the moment, the system is like having the heating on with the windows open. The football governance structures will close those windows, right? So for me, the Premier League's money is going to be better, more safely managed, looked after in League 2, League 1, with better governance structures in place.
Yeah, which makes sense, yeah.
My own view is that the Premier League just shouldn't be seen as the sugar daddy for the rest of the football pyramid, and that the pyramid should be able to create its own financial sustainability. And part of that, in my view, is that lower down the pyramid you should be able to have a 3G pitch, artificial pitch,
and be able to monetize that through
and monetize it throughout the thing. So, you know, and although all the media reporting has turned this into a Premier League issue, one of those things was around alcohol at stadiums. You know, it's and this came from the conversations that we had with National League North and South, where clubs like Maidstone, Dulwich, are able to, in National League South, serve alcohol in view of the pitch, and raise a significant amount of revenue from it, which enables them to invest on their talent on the pitch. That Maidstone got promoted and had to stop its alcohol sales and wiped out a significant chunk
of its revenue,
of its revenue, and went straight back down.
Yeah.
And so you then have this...
Didn't Maidstone have an artificial pitch as well at one point?
Yeah, it's still got an artificial pitch.
Yeah.
But it only went to National League Premier, so it didn't need to go up. Whereas Sutton obviously needed to go up.
Used to get big crowds, Maidstone.
Still does.
Yeah, still does.
Still does. And, you know, and it's a fun environment. But actually, that whole alcohol thing becomes a disincentive, a weird sort of kind of disincentive for them not to get promoted, because it's not financially good for them. It's great for fans, you know, they want to see their teams playing all over the country. Yeah. You know, top talent, and then with the, you know, obviously the Roy the Rovers' dream of, you know, keep going all the way up, Wrexham style.
You can't have a system whereby it is financially damaging to move up the pyramid. I mean, in some ways it should at least be cost neutral, and ideally there should be greater revenues coming as a consequence, not the inverse. And it's interesting because obviously the licensing model includes the National League, which is obviously subject to slightly different rules than those clubs within the EFL. So it'll be interesting to see how that sort of pulls together.
It'll be light touch, and it's, you know, and I think that's what we need to keep remembering, is that it is going to be a proportionate system throughout, but nonetheless, I think good governance should work wherever you are in the system.
Yeah.
So, you know, you have to have good governance if you're a FA grassroots club, charter club.
Yeah.
So why shouldn't you have good governance if you're a National League Premier club?
100%. It's interesting. We'll not go into it in detail. You know, time is against us. But you mentioned the distribution of revenues, the distribution waterfall. I mean, that was obviously one of the most hotly debated, you know, parts of the review recommendations.
Well, it still is.
And obviously, how it now looks in the current legislative drafts. It's, you know, it's so you have the advocacy first, then mediation, then a final binding arbitration. I mean, that has been a kind of a hotly debated area, hasn't it?
Yeah, and I mean, I think, bear in mind, let's go back to the point that this review was published in 2021, and there is still no financial deal. The review basically suggested that there should be some form of mediation between the Premier League and the EFL to come to a deal. And if they couldn't do it themselves, then they should get in some sort of consultancy to help them do it. And by the way, both the Premier League and EFL and clubs within both those authorities have suggested ideas as to what can be done. And there has to be some form of, people call it parachute payments, but there has to be some kind of smoothing between relegation of leagues, and that includes from Championship down to League One and League One to League Two. There has to be a smoothing process. But we're now 2025, there's still no deal done, and that has been the reason for why there is now a backstop in the legislation, because they can't seem to sit down and do this deal. I agree, by the way, with those who sit there and say the regulator shouldn't have anything to do with our redistribution. No, you're right. But it's being forced to
it doesn't
because
want to,
you can't sit down and do it yourself. This is the nuclear option. Right?
So the nuclear option is this kind of pendulum arbitration, final offer arbitrate.
I mean, just because you've got a nuclear button doesn't mean you have to push it.
No.
So, and the way you stop people from pushing it is to sit down and negotiate a deal.
Let's kind of move into your current role, your current day-to-day professional life at Hanover. Now, obviously, your passion for sport and obviously considerable experience and skills that you've built up have taken you in this kind of new direction. Hanover is obviously very well known and highly regarded as one of the top comms and public affairs consultancies in the market, but I'm keen to hear a bit more about Hanover's plans and indeed what it is doing and is seeking to do within the sports sector.
Well, the good thing about Hanover Sport is that it is part of a
bigger
global agency.
Yes, and that brings resources, doesn't it?
It does, and it means that actually with potential clients sort of kind of inquiring as to what it is that we can do, the truth is we can do everything. And I think, you don't have to go to different agencies for different things because you've got all of the talent, all the expertise in one particular team. So if you wanted to do storytelling, or if you wanted to do event management, or if you wanted to do crisis comms, or even advocacy, then you have the capacity to do that. So it's like being a boutique offering, but with the safety net of sort of kind of a large agency. And I think, that's one of the things that really made attracted me to the role of MD, is that I have just this incredible team who have so much experience, so much sort of kind of interesting and innovative and creative ideas. And, I'm learning from them, but at the same time, hopefully bringing some of my background into what they're doing on a daily basis for existing and potential future clients.
How have you found that shift from public life into the private sector, out of interest?
So it's been a bit of a reintegration process. Parliament is an institution, and you are hidden from a lot of the day-to-day kind of corporate life. So there are bits of it that are just a bit weird, like not having emails pinging all weekend, or I go to the supermarket at the weekend and nobody bothers me about a particular issue. I was on a week's leave for half term and didn't feel the need to dial into the computer. I mean, obviously I haven't quite got that stage yet, and still looking at my emails on a fairly regular basis, but it's just a very different world. Although there's obviously a hierarchy, there isn't at the same time. That's sort of kind of weird contradiction. So I've got some people in my team who are very young, but what they bring to the team is just extraordinary, and I feel like I'm learning from them.
Oh, completely agree with you.
I mean, they say things, and I'm really sorry. You're going to have to just dial back a second and explain what that means. Or they talk about influencers
Yeah.
that I have never heard of, which is great because
Yeah.
I'm not supposed to be the core audience, and
No.
frankly, if I have heard of them, they're probably not the right people
Yes.
that we are
Yes.
proposing to clients. So I'm really enjoying it, and I think it was, it's challenging for me to try and bring a new business, and but it's a challenge that I'm really enjoying, and
it's an exciting
it's
challenge,
exciting.
isn't it? And it's something that's new and fresh, and obviously you've achieved so much in your career up to this point, but to do something slightly different, that kind of, as you say, a new business role, I mean, there's something just energizing about that. It's a very kind of, and it's it keeps you on your toes as well, doesn't it?
And I've brought in new clients, and since I started in September, and I'm really enjoying rolling my sleeves up and getting stuck in and coming up with suggestions and being creative, and they're all skills that you have as a politician. I just don't think you recognise them as a skill.
Yeah.
When you're trying to articulate something really quite challenging to either a constituent or to a minister,
different audience, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. But also you have to sell it. But what the product you're selling is not your client; it's yourself. So when you're a politician, you're selling in something that is particularly interesting to you, but it might not be interesting to a news audience. So you have to try and make it interesting to a news audience. You have to try and think of ways of getting out of your usual political audience, and getting it into a world where other people are consuming it. And that's exactly the same as storytelling for a particular sports client, who want to take their message beyond the sports pages.
Yeah.
And that's what the team are brilliant at, and I'm watching them and
learning.
cheering them on and supporting them.
It's lovely to hear you talk about, notwithstanding everything you've achieved, your obviously profile and fame within the sports industry, but you're still saying I'm learning from, more junior members of my team, and I must admit I find that as well. I mean, I obviously am privileged to head up the sports department at Sheridan's, but my goodness, the caliber of the young lawyers or the next generation of lawyers at a firm like Sheridan's is just mind-boggling, and I find myself constantly, watching, observing, learning from them, and obviously it works in a kind of a circular, symbiotic process. But that's part of the thrill of the job. It's part of the excitement of the job, and you've got to be open to that, right?
Yeah, for sure. And their appetite to learn and to do things, to get their hands dirty is extraordinary. One of the things, though, that I've always been particularly conscious of, and it's challenged more, I think, in the outside world than it was in Westminster, is I never called the people who worked for me, because I was their boss, in Westminster staff. I always saw them as my team.
Yeah.
And although they had different ranks from a HR perspective, I never saw them as anything other than equivalent. And I feel the same at Hanover.
Yeah.
Of course, from an HR perspective, they have titles, they have salaries that are applicable to those titles, they have different training requirements and so on. Everything. It's an HR thing, but for me, they're not staff. They're the team.
Yeah, I love that word, team first.
Always. And I may be the leader in that team by virtue of experience and seniority, but that's it.
Completely agree.
No one goes and gets my coffee unless I'm getting theirs next or whatever. It's just there's never anything like that. And in Westminster, we would have people come and do work experience. They weren't there to photocopy and tidy the office or file. They were there to learn and to experience, and that's the same as it's always been. And and that's something that I love. We're open plan. I sit with the team. They're talking about some client need, and I can just pipe up over the screen with something, or vice versa, and crack on. It doesn't. Also, the virtue of being open plan is doesn't mean it's billable, right? You just sit there and bring your wisdom without having to then put it on a timesheet.
Yes. I guess timesheets is something you're probably going to get used to as well.
Yeah. Well, I worked in agency before, so nothing much has changed there.
That's cool. Listen, we're now on to the final section. It's sort of a bit more formulaic, but before we go on to that, obviously you've had, and I've sort of touched upon this throughout the podcast, you've had quite an extraordinary career, I guess, from being banned from playing football because you were a girl through to leading what can only be described as a seismic sea change in sports and football governance. Tracey, it's not an easy question, but how do you reflect on that journey? Are you able to reflect on? Have you reflected on that journey? Maybe you haven't. I don't know.
I do and I don't. I mean, sometimes I just think what I've just done is just been part of a journey. You know.
Yeah.
I don't ever
Overthink it almost. You don't overthink it.
I don't overthink it. You know, sometimes I've just been in the right place at the right time. Sometimes, you know, it's just a bit of luck. Sometimes it's because of the brilliance of the people around me. I don't look back and think, wow, you know, I did that. And maybe I should sometimes. You know, sometimes people do say to me, you know, you did this. And I think, gosh. And I think there's one, I guess the one thing that I do know that I did, and I do reflect on that, is when I resigned from government over the issue of fixed or betting terminals, which then led to a change in government policy. Right up until the end of my days in Parliament, I would get emails from people saying that I saved their life, because it's so kind of really enabled them to get to grips with their gambling addiction. And I think that's something that was, you know, was quite I guess a tangible thing. I think that I look at things like the football governance review. You know, I was asked to do it by the Prime Minister, and I did it. And Prime Ministers have changed since then, governments have changed since then. But, you know, I engaged with the fans. I enjoyed doing it. It wasn't a chore. I just finished chemotherapy, so it was just like it gave me something else to
through that
think
at the same
about.
time. I mean, that's you know, that's what I mean about trying to reflect on that. It's almost it's so big. It's hard to reflect on it unless you kind of do it, unless you consciously do so, I suppose.
But I suppose I just don't consciously think back on those things. I just, you know.
Well, that's because you're a doer, right? You get on and do your job. That's.
It's not just doing job; it's just doing life.
So
right?
you won't look back on 5 years when the independent regulator is up and running, and you won't. And that's my legacy, so to speak. That's kind of just part of the journey, rather than, or maybe you will in 20 years.
Yeah,
I don't know.
maybe. I mean, the thing is we'll never know what the legacy is, because if anything, you know, it will stop some of the mistakes that were being made, and you can't really kind of judge whether or not those mistakes would have been made had the regulator not been there.
Yeah.
The one thing I'm pretty certain of is that whenever anything goes wrong in football, it will always be my fault. So, you know...
Yes, you can be rest assured that label will attach to you
forever. You know, but other than that, you know, it's going to be hard to tell what the success is, because ultimately you won't know whether or not the mistakes were going to be made, because they would have been prevented from being made. So that's a challenge with the football regulator. But I think in other things, you know, I just get on with it, to be honest with you. I was lucky enough to climb Kilimanjaro a few years ago and summited, and you know, I just remember sitting there thinking, it's not a challenge if it's not hard.
Yeah.
And that's the way I kind of think about things anyway, is that, you know, it's not, you know, life is hard, right?
Yeah, it's not a straight line.
It's not a straight, and you have just to overcome those challenges. And wouldn't it be really boring if you didn't have all those challenges? And so that's just the way I kind of think about it, really.
Yeah, there's that famous Kobe Bryant quote where he simply said, "You've just got to put one foot in front of the other and keep walking."
Yeah, and I keep on.
I suppose that's what you did when you were moving up the summit of
very
Mount
slowly,
Kilimanjaro.
poly for anyone who's done it.
As I said, there is our kind of formulaic question with which we end the podcast, and I did want to ask you that, and it's one we always ask our guests, and it's, what trends today, in this case, do you see coming down the tunnel within the sports sector, the sports industry, which will significantly influence or shape the sports sector over the next few years? Ideally don't say the independent regulator. It would be the easy one for you to say, but by all means do so if you wish.
No, I don't think it's the independent regulator. I think that's just one thing in one sport. I think that I think the trend that I think sport is going to face over the next few years is just changing consumer interest, and how they are absorbing their sport. So we've had a fairly linear way of consuming sport over many years, and
just broadcast, point of view.
Exactly, and although the broadcast landscape has changed, certainly from the 3 channels or 4 channels that I had when I was growing up, actually I just think that people are dialing in differently to sport, and I think people are coming to sport in a different way. And I look at people, influencers, let's go back to the influencers again, people like Ilona Meyer, who's bringing a whole new generation of
love her.
Rugby fans into women rugby fans. And you think, well, how is that going to then translate into the next thing? And by the way, there won't be another Ilona Meyer.
You could argue she's the most important person in rugby.
You could argue that, for sure. And she's fascinating. And I look at someone like my 22-year-old niece, who has no interest in sport, but would happily go and watch Bristol.
Because of Ilona?
Because of Ilona. And, and I think that is just an extraordinary, way of sort of seeing that change, that trend. And the other thing I think is AI. It's going to be really important. I don't quite know how, but it is something that I think that we can both embrace and fear at the same time.
Yeah.
And I think it's got potential to change data around sport, and that will potentially drive change in, for example, gambling in sport and where the consumption for that is happening. So I don't know the answer to either of those things, but I can certainly see those as 2 sort of kind of waves on the horizon.
I'm actually heartened that you've said, you've made both of those predictions, because I'm going to plug our Sheridan's 2025 and beyond trends for the sports industry predictions, which you can get hold of and download from all of our social channels, LinkedIn and Instagram and all of the above, and AI in sport, and also the changing consumption habits are 2/3 of the 16 or so trends that we've identified. So I'm quite heartened that you've also identified those. Look, Tracey, I mean, I've see, we've only got to know each other recently, so you'll not know this, but I've obviously observed your career from afar for a long period of time.
Not in a weird way, though.
Not in a way, just to be clear, in an entirely professional way. Obviously, I've worked with Sport England and UK Sport now going back over 10 years, and obviously, as you say, your sports policy when you came in 2015 was very much the I guess the preemptor of what became the sports governance code. So obviously, in a professional context, I've admired your work, and I think the word trailblazer is overused, but I think it is in truth apt to describe what you've achieved over the last 20 or so years of your career, and not just in relation to the fan-led review. Everyone talks about that, but there's so much more to your career and your life than just that. So from my perspective, it's been a genuine privilege and an honour to have had the chance to sit down and speak to you and chat through all of these issues, and look, thank you so much for taking the time. I know how busy you are. So
thank you for having me.
Cool. Thank you very much.